All right, welcome everyone as you're filtering in. We're going to hang out for 2 minutes, maybe, let people log on, get their self situated, and then we're going to jump right in. As you log on to the Zoom, if you wouldn't mind throwing your name and where you are in the chat, that'd be great. And as a little icebreaker, why don't we put something else in the chat as well? Why don't you say if you've tried using ChatGPT yet, and if so, what one thing you've tried using it for? And to make it not awkward, we will volunteer answers to the same question. Camden, have you used ChatGPT? Actually, have you used it for coding things or just writing things?
No, I've used it for a lot of coding things. Yeah, code snippets
How'd
usually.
it work?
And it works really well for just little small discrete tasks.
So it's not coming for your job.
Not yet. Well, we'll see. I got 2 more years at least.
I don't know if anyone's a ChatGPT power user, but oh, nice. Ryan says use it to come up with puns for a podcast. That's great. I feel like I used ChatGPT 3 and I asked it to come up with triple alliteration phrases like ping pong paddle and Better Business Bureau, and it totally failed. But ChatGPT 4 totally succeeded. It was actually pretty wild. Paul used it to do strategic objectives for an interview session. Nice. How'd it work? That seems like actually what it'd be really, really good at. I heard that there's like certain words that it uses disproportionately or disproportionate to like everyday language and text, like delve and innovate. So the training data seems like it's really it's like trained on people's resumes or things like that. So it must be good for that type of thing, Paul. Kirsten, do you have anything to share?
I usually just use it to rewrite things that I think sound bad, but I don't have the capacity to make them sound better. But honestly, it's like a 50% success rate at this point, so I've stopped using it as much.
Oh, interesting. Huh. Cool, Paul. All right, what do you think? 30 more seconds. We'll count down in our heads and then we'll get going. Welcome, everyone. Thanks again for joining.
We have an otter AI in the house.
Dick, I can't tell if you're answering the question about whether you've used ChatGPT or introducing yourself or some of both, but that's great. Cool. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us on this webinar. My name is Alex. I lead the broadband team at the Center on Rural Innovation, and today we are going to share with you a number of tools and resources that we've created to help rural areas better engage with the BEAD process. Quick introductions here. I'm joined by my colleagues Kirsten Lardy and Camden Blatchley. They both were the ones that did the vast majority of work in putting this stuff together, so I'm excited to have them be able to talk a little bit about what they did. And just quickly go over what we're hoping to accomplish today, but keep in mind, we will have plenty of time at the end for questions. Questions can be about what we presented or expand into other realms of broadband. So feel free to put questions in the chat along the way. We will curate them, and some we might jump in and answer right away. Some we might wait till the end, but looking forward to having a robust discussion to wrap things up after we get through the presentation. So I'm just going to take us through a quick overview of what the toolkit we created has and is. Kirsten is going to share some examples of specific resources that we created to help people apply to BEAD. Camden is going to walk us through what's involved in the browser-based map we created to help people visualize and manipulate the FCC data in a better and more effective way. And then we'll jump into the Q&A. So here at CORI, we work with a lot of rural areas, obviously, and we work with a lot of small rural ISPs. And one thing that we've heard for at least a year now from the people we work with is that it's a real bummer that BEAD grant rules structurally favor bigger incumbent ISPs so heavily. And we're firm believers in rural areas taking matters into their own hands and establishing kind of local ownership of telecommunications. And so what we wanted to do is provide some resources to try to help make smaller ISPs in rural areas a little more competitive with the BEAD grant process. Because we do think that the more that smaller ISPs can be competitive, right, the more options that state broadband offices will have for awarding funding, and ultimately the more rural communities will benefit. So there's a couple primary pieces to the resources we created. We've got a BEAD broadband funding guide that helps ISPs kind of understand what they need to know about the rules and be strategic with their applications and kind of think through the right things they need to do, the right timing of that, and a bunch more items that Kirsten will go into more detail with. And it was all built with small ISP leadership in mind. That was our core user, and the folks who interact with those users and support them, whether that's grant writers, broadband planners, or rural public sector leadership. I think I'm sending it over to Kirsten for this one, so great.
Great, thank you. So for the application funding resources, the guide, we have the goal is just to increase the competitiveness of BEAD applications for small ISPs, like Alex already said. Mostly we do this, we help you understand relevant pieces of legislation and requirements, and then how you can have some strategies or ways to think through these requirements to make your application more competitive. Now, it is more general, which means that you still will need to look at the volume 2 of your eligible entities and kind of compare and contrast the strategies we provide. But it's a really good way to jumpstart into understanding how certain rulings can impact the bottom line of your network build, okay? And then for public sector leaders, this is a really good way to understand basically the complexity of a BEAD and the pressure that is put on ISPs and why smaller ISPs may not be as open to or gung-ho to apply for BEAD. So there's a lot of compliance issues. There's a lot of requirements post grant reporting. So it kind of goes through all of the things that an ISP may need to be competitive and may even at the end of the day make someone decide, hey, maybe this isn't for me. So it's just a really good way to get started in the process and to fully wrap your head around what it really means to be part of this process. I think I'll kick it back over to Alex for this one, or
Sure. Yeah. So the second kind of component to this, we built a two-legged stool here. The second leg of the stool is an online interactive broadband map. And we'll do a live demonstration of this at the end of the meeting today. But the primary things we want the map to achieve is to allow potential BEAD applicants to explore eligible project areas and create a high-level grant strategy using a really easy, simple tool, no GIS experience required, and just to really kind of understand where the opportunities are. And for public sector officials who want to keep up to date on what's happening in BEAD and try to work to make sure somebody gets resources for their area, the tool has been helpful thus far with allowing those types of people to understand who's well positioned to apply, who the different options are, and therefore to then target conversations with the ISPs that you want to be applying to help encourage them and offer to collaborate and support them.
So I'm going to go over a couple examples from the funding guide. So this is the first section. here's a brief outline of what it looks like. It's divided into 4 categories: required documentation, primary criteria, secondary criteria, and printable resources. So primary criteria and secondary criteria, those are going to be your points, where you're going to score points. And then the required documentation, that's going to look at what the applicant needs to prove or provide to the state broadband office, that they basically showing that they can handle all of the compliance and regulatory requirements that come along with BEAD. So we actually pulled 2 examples out of this just to show you kind of what they look like. Again, feel free to go to the link and follow along if you prefer that way. So we're going to go with our first example is from the required documentation outline. It basically, this is part of a pre-qualification phase in some states. So most entities are going to have a pre-qualification round, and that's basically just to ensure it's like a screening phase. So who's going to qualify and who's not qualified to actually submit project proposals. It's going to take a lot of the end reading through project proposals on the end side of this process it's going to reduce those requirements for state workers here. So take a look at volume 2 of your entity's initial proposal to see the specific requirements, but for each pre-qualification phase. But for the most part, this is really just going to be about operational capacity, managerial capacity, and financial capacity. So in this case, eligible entities are going to want to know, can you carry out activities in compliance with all of the relevant laws? Do you have the managerial and financial capacity to kind of go through this process? And can you execute the technical and operational needs of building a broadband network? So some of our suggestions for this section are basically you can start collecting documentation surrounding this right now, even if your application portals aren't open. This includes resumes of key management personnel, narratives that show that you've basically worked on projects of a similar scope, and organizational policies that show that you can work in post-grant compliance. And just keep in mind that if you have partners and subcontractors and contractors, you're going to need this documentation for everyone that's involved in the project. And if you're a new entity that's entering the broadband space, and you don't have historical records of compliance or historical records of a similar project, that just means you're going to have to detail how you're going to do all of these things. So our general advice in a lot of these pre-qualification certificates is to provide as much detail as you can, so there's less back and forth and there's a lot less red flags. And then for affordability, that's going to be the part of a primary criteria requirement. Typically, these are worth between 15 and 40% of scoring. However, 40% is kind of an outlier. So most of the time, you're going to see your state falling around the 15% mark. Applicants, depending on where you are, affordability can be pretty flexible or it can be prescribed. So you're going to need both a middle class and a low cost affordability plan. But how that looks for each state is gonna be determined again in the volume 2. So if you're a small ISP and you may not be able to offer the competitive pricing that's required from the state, you may actually just take a couple points off just to make sure your plan is still sustainable. And you're going to want to look and make sure that you can and see if you can make those points up somewhere else, whether that's local coordination and local support or open access. So really looking at at everything in a holistic way and understanding that it might not be feasible for you as a small ISP to provide the lowest cost, but it's okay to lose points in certain areas if it's not a sustainable business plan. Some critical advice we have in this category is going to be, if your state doesn't provide a benchmark price, then make sure you're very clear in your analysis and your logic as to why you've determined a certain price for your region. So you can see in this example from Kansas that this is an example of a prescribed price. If you are less than $90, you get the full 15 points, and then they have ranges, whereas if you're more than 120, you get 0 points. Not all states do this. Some states are going to say, use your regional, what other ISPs in the region provide, and use that as a benchmark, or maybe you can use the income levels in your region as well to provide some sort of justification for whatever that price is. But whatever it is, always keep in mind that you're going to want to make this as easy and clear for the broadband office to read. That will give you some indirect points as well. And then something else is determining the sustainability, which I mentioned before, but without ACP, the sustainability of a low-cost option is going to change a lot for smaller ISPs. So you don't have that guaranteed $30 a month coming in from a certain percentage of your low-income subscribers. And how does that impact your bottom line? And then also in some states, low-cost options, if you make them available to everyone and not just qualified subscribers, that can also satisfy a middle-class tier. So it could save you some extra work to provide a middle-class service tier. Maybe you just want to provide a low-income option, a low-cost option for everyone, and that would satisfy some of those requirements. So that's just a little bit of what our funding resources are going to look like. As always, again, to reiterate, you're going to need your volume two to kind of really get the most out of these resources, because we couldn't make something specific for each territory or state. But if you have any questions or advice or need advice, additional advice that's more specific to your state, we're always here for you. And there's also a form on the website that you can fill out.
Great. We've also developed the interactive rural broadband service map. It's an analytic map focused on helping you identify BEAD eligibility. So it incorporates FCC broadband service data, which is then displayed at the census block level. We've also joined in at the block level federal funding data. So in the current version of the tool, there's RDOF, Rural Digital Opportunity Fund data. And then this week, we're going to release additional data in there, including Capital Projects Fund, enhanced ACAM, and more. So stay tuned for that. We also provide the ability to select blocks and view detailed broadband technology and speed data at the block level, along with maps of reported ISP footprints, and then also useful filters for zoning in on your specific area of interest. Cool. So one disclaimer about the map is that is based on FCC data, which is sort of an ongoing and iterative process. It depends on data submitted by providers, but then it's continuously revised based on challenges and also verifications by the FCC. So the mapping tool should be used for high-level analysis, and then data from eligible entities should be used in your final application. Cool. So some ways that you may want to use the map for your applications. The first one would be identifying areas of continuous or eligible areas in your county or near existing infrastructure. Looking at what blocks have prior enforceable commitments due to receiving prior federal funding, and then also identifying ISPs in the area, and also figuring out what combination of ISP technology and speeds are causing areas to be marked as served or underserved.
Awesome. All right, now we're going to jump in and use the map live, which means we are going to pick a county and go to do some test cases there. I think we're going to try using Garrett County, Maryland, in honor of the public official Cheryl DeBerry, who works there on broadband. She usually attends some of our webinars, and she does a fantastic job. Has been working on broadband for quite some time now. So we thought we'd give a shout out to Cheryl DeBerry and look at Garrett County. But if anyone has an interest in us kind of doing a similar live demo in their county after this one's done, we'll be taking questions and can pull the map back up as well. So we're looking at Garrett in the middle of our screen there. And the first thing you'll notice is that the map is colored by whether or not the area is served, underserved, or unserved, according to the BEAD service tiers. So this data, as Camden mentioned, is based on the FCC's data, and it's at the block level. As you may know, if you're following the BEAD process, there will be a challenge period where some states' data will diverge from the FCC's data. That kind of depends on how much effort they put into the challenge process. But what this map will show you regardless is kind of a pretty good understanding of what areas are eligible and what areas aren't eligible. You can click through, as we're doing now, to just isolate items at different tiers, served, unserved, or underserved. Another thing that you can look at is areas that have been previously awarded RDOF funding. And as Camden mentioned, we're going to increase the features within the next couple days to add other previously awarded federal funds. So this is a big issue with eligibility, making sure that you're not applying for areas that have been previously awarded. As you can see here, the RDOF funding really only covers the northwest part of the county. And so the large swaths to the east and the south that are eligible for BEAD should remain eligible. Another feature that we threw in here that impacts some counties quite a bit and doesn't impact others is the filter to count all DSL as underserved. This is an option that states have been given by the NTIA to say that all DSL should be considered underserved. And it doesn't look like that's having a significant impact in this county, but in some other counties it does, because DSL providers sometimes report pretty fast speeds right around their central offices, even if those technologies and those speeds aren't really scalable. So that's why this waiver was established. Another thing that you can do, which is in a couple different ways, is start to look at the ISP footprints in the area. Now, if you take your mouse and you hover over a block that's served, you can see who serves there and what types of technologies are there. And so let's just say we're looking at this block and we see that the ISP QCOL serves there. And if Cheryl were on, she could tell us whether or not QCOL is an ISP that she'd want to work with, but let's pretend they are and display their footprint. So what we're now seeing is exactly where that ISP has reported they provide service, which then would allow a county official here to say, okay, where are the places that it's most logical for them to expand? You know, it looks like there's some adjacent unserved areas. If we took the time, we could look at the adjacent unserved areas in other parts of the county as well. And that's it's a good way to kind of map out and see from a 30,000-foot view what ISPs are optimally situated to expand into what areas. Lastly, to scroll all the way down in the panel, you'll see a few other ways that you can kind of filter the map. You can filter it by technology, so you can see where fiber is in the county, for example. You can filter the data by ISP so that you're still, and here's where DSL is in the county. For example, you can also filter by ISP so that you can see where exactly that particular ISP is. So these filters are adding together. So this is only in locations where both Xfinity exists and DSL service exists, right? It does not mean that Xfinity is offering DSL. So if I just X out of the DSL button, you'll see, well, that actually kind of makes sense that it doesn't change, but the Xfinity footprint, Comcast footprint is really what we're looking at here. So I think I'm going to pause there and check the chat for questions. Marla, great. How many times are you updating the maps from the challenges and providers? Is it real time? Alas, it is not real time. So we're working on, so the FCC data that we're using, they usually have a major release every 6 months. And so that's the cadence that we're using to update the data. However, there's all sorts of other pieces of data that are involved in this. As we mentioned, we're updating the federal awards, previously enforceable federal awards data in the next couple of days to expand that beyond RDOF. Now, there will be a period of time where federal awards will be coming in hot and heavy from all different states as they run their capital projects fund projects, as Reconnect happens. And so I think all states and the federal government is going to struggle to be fully up to date with this. We're going to do the best we can, but I think to set realistic expectations, it's not going to be instantaneous by any means. do we want to kind of run through any other questions? Let's see, we got other, any else want to answer a question? We can also kick us off with some questions that were submitted as part of the registration for this.
If there aren't any other questions, I think one of the questions we were asked is, what are the anticipated choke points in the BEAD process now that we've gotten to April? Alex, do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, well, the NTIA is several months behind where they said they were going to be. So that's one ongoing choke point, right? They're in their process of reviewing all the everything that the states are providing. I think the actually related to the previous question about mapping and data quality, the future choke points that I think are going to really hit everyone harder than we're anticipating is this idea of where is the single source of truth for what broadband areas are eligible based on previous awards, and therefore how are states going to evaluate proposals accounting for that kind of changing landscape. So the unfortunate truth is that there are state level and federal broadband programs running in parallel. State broadband offices are not only going to need to evaluate applicants based on that changing landscape, but if you can imagine the difficulty of doing that while at the same time negotiating to try to make sure that every area gets covered, right, with the Internet for All mandate that's attached to this program, I think that is going to take way longer than any state is anticipating. So I would, from here on out, I would expect no state to open their grant process earlier than June. And then I would expect most states to open their grant process after June. And then I would expect the big crunch period to be once the applications are in and states have to evaluate them and negotiate to try to cover everything. Because and this is actually some advice that's in our toolkit, right? State broadband offices will be trying to take applications and tinker with them to ensure everywhere gets covered, which means back and forth negotiations with applicants to say, well, could you expand your coverage area to include this area you didn't have included? Or can we actually shave this off because we need to shave this off and give it to someone else so that their application works? And in exchange, we'll do this for you, right? That's going to take forever. And so I think that's going to be a huge choke point if states are earnestly doing that work as they say they're going to be.
Okay, we have another question. How does the challenge process compare for rural locations compared to urban locations?
Cool. You want to take that one, Kirsten?
Anecdotally take a little bit of this one. I think that we've seen a lot of challenge processes are gonna need a lot of community outreach and sometimes door-to-door canvassing and technical know-how. In particular, I live in a rural area. I've worked in my county. It can be hard to kind of galvanize rural organization in a time where people are kind of tired of hearing about broadband. So, right, we've had communities engage in the challenge process for the FCC maps, right? They've been kind of asked to do all of this engagement work over the past 2 years. And now once again, we're asking them to do some engagement work. So I think for rural areas, that can be really difficult. Not only do you have strapped local capacity for getting communities organized and together, but then you also just have a waning interest at this point for fixing yet another map, or more data, right? So I think that can be a really big hurdle for rural areas trying to get involved in the challenge process. On top of that, you're seeing that the challenge process, in terms of being the most efficient for engagement, you oftentimes want to use an area. I can't remember what it's called, like an area challenge. So if you have 6 locations within a census block, I believe it is. Alex, can you confirm that's what it is? That might be easier in an urban area where there's a lot more people. Maybe be a little bit more difficult when you're looking at rural areas.
Yeah, I can confirm that. I think, the same divide that we see with resources that entities have to devote to this challenge, I think will persist through the challenge process. So Kirsten mentioned it's a resource intensive endeavor. If you have to go door to door, the resources to do that are going to be really challenging. The other thing is some of the best data you can use to challenge is like actual documentation of where infrastructure exists, which you might have because you've done a good inventory of the utilities in your community, or you have conduit underground, or what have you. But the entities that have the GIS departments that are more likely to have that data or know how to get it easily are the bigger entities, because there's just more resources. So I think that's another way that this relates to the rural urban ability to comply with this process. All right, should we take another question? Or if anyone wants to throw a region into the map or into the chat, we can happily kind of explore that on the map live. Oh, and it looks like Paul asked about tribal areas. That's a great question. We don't have that currently on the map, but we've got a pipeline of requests of what people have wanted us to do to improve the map. No promises if and when we'll be able to get to it, but it's a great idea. We should definitely, Camden is noting down that we'll put it into the pipeline and try to make it happen. And so it looks like this is kind of the area that you're looking at, Paul. Okay. Yeah, well, looks like you got some areas that are eligible. And then as you'll notice, there's also some blank areas on the map. I think those are areas without data. You can verify from an on-the-ground perspective, but if there's no data for an area because there's no locations there, then it won't show up.
Paul, I'm curious if you have any questions that you have been struggling to answer that maybe the map could help with, or other than having that layer that you asked about.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. That's what we hope they can do.
So Alex, you want to maybe look at some ISPs in the area just to get an idea?
Yeah, sure. So, you know what, actually, yeah, let's look at, let's click on some of these. This is a feature we didn't really demonstrate. So if you click on a census block, you'll see it become highlighted. And the nice thing about that is then we can start to aggregate information based on clicking on a series of them. So we're clicking on census blocks in a served area. We can do that and then show you what it looks like in an unserved area. But essentially, if you click down on the green thing like we just did, you can see some information that helps you understand the opportunity for expansion and the opportunity for for pursuing a grant. So here's an aggregation of the service levels and the premises. You've got a kind of documentation of who is serving internet there and what speeds they're at. And a link to a county summary. So anyways, this is especially if you're looking at expansion areas, you can we can clear the selection and go back up. If you're looking at expansion areas, these and underserved areas, you can click through and kind of create a target area to expand. So we're just clicking on all the areas around the green right there. And you can do this with more detail if you have a more specific area, but that'll essentially tell you, okay, look, there's only 10% of the locations have 100/20, 90% unserved, and no previous federal funding. So that kind of gives you a sense of what the opportunity is like in that area. Yeah, Paul, Paul noted in the chat, just so that I'll say it out loud, I think it's a very good point. Several rural broadband representatives are concerned that the BEAD funding conditions rule out any small ISPs, as they felt would not be able to meet some of the capacity conditions. So we're with you on that. There's the organizational capacity. So there's some capacity issues that are fixable for small ISPs, right? If you don't have a cybersecurity plan because you've never put one together before, you haven't been big enough to make it a priority, right? That's fixable, and we've got a module on doing that. There are other challenges like the 25% letter of credit or 25% match and the letter of credit, which are going to be harder for small ISPs. With interest rates going up, it's really hard to access commercial lending vehicles for a 25% match to a sizable BEAD application. And so that's just a reality that these small ISPs are having to live with. Our intent for this tool was to make it easier for ISPs to even get to the point where they can decide whether they have the capacity to apply or not. And we're hoping that as many can apply as possible, but very realistic in that this program is not for everyone, and structurally it's not designed to be useful to all ISPs. Yeah. Okay. All right, let's see if we can maybe draw from the well of pre-submitted questions one more time. So a couple quick hits from the questions we got ahead of time. This map does not include mobile broadband, right? It is only the fixed broadband in the map. And will previously funded project areas have an opportunity to be funded again? Seemingly a simple question, not the most simple answer. But generally, if it's been funded to 100/20, the answer is definitely no. If it's been funded, there are some ACAM programs still out there that were not funded to that level, right? They should be eligible, I believe. There's also a phenomenon happening where various RDOF winners were awarded regions and are now defaulting on their obligations. So if and when they default, those areas become eligible again. So we have incorporated the most up-to-date data on RDOF, and we've removed the areas that have defaulted because those areas are eligible again. There's always a chance that that could happen in the future. So state broadband offices, not all of them have done this, but they are supposed to be the final source of truth for eligibility within their jurisdictions.
And just to reiterate, if you are a smaller ISP or you have small ISPs in your area that are struggling, that your broadband office should be a very easily accessible source of help and questions. So establishing that relationship as soon as possible and having a strong relationship there will be helpful in the long run if this is a path that you would like to take.
Great. Okay, so Marla asks, how do we find RDOF defaults? So the RDOF data is released by the FCC, and it's an incredibly challenging data set with a lot of different kind of data categories and different versions. I am fairly confident that the data in this map is up to date for the time being. And Camden, I don't know if you know off the top of your head. If not, we can reach out to Marla separately about more detailed advice on that. In terms of how often are we going to be able to update it here? Are there any other sources of good information, trustworthy information on that point?
Cool. Yeah, I believe there's default info at a block level, but I'll touch base with our data engineer and get back to you.
Great. All right, any other questions? Thank you all for coming to this webinar. As always, please reach out to us if you have any questions. We're always happy to talk. Love to hear what's going on in little corners of the country. And yeah, please stay in touch. And let us know what you think of the tool. Let us know if you have any other feature requests or requests for more information. Thanks, everyone.